Welcome to this video podcast on the lesson plan template for the English teaching major for our program. Our objective for this podcast is primarily that you be able to use the template that has been provided, that we've put together as a program, to help you plan for purposeful and meaningful learning. Now, as a part of that, in this podcast, we're going to talk about how to craft purposeful learning objectives, and then how to take your learning activities, the assessments, and everything else that goes into a lesson plan, and how to connect those together. The lesson plan template itself is divided into two sections. You've got the planning section, and then you've got the performing section. In the planning section, you think through some of your objectives, some of the general things, materials you're going to need, the kind of stuff you do before you teach the lesson. And in the performing part is where you're actually going to write out something of a script that will describe what you do, what you say, what you anticipate students will say, and things like that. We'll talk about each part separately here. So let's talk first about the planning section. In this section, you're going to detail the objectives that you have. You're going to tie those into the state core. You're going to identify some materials you need and the concepts and the strategies that you're going to need in this lesson, that you're going to use in this lesson. The teaching strategies, that is. So we're going to look first at objectives, and we're going to spend most of our time there talking about the learning objectives, because those are the most important part, and that, quite honestly, is where most students seem to struggle in this part of the lesson plan. So let's talk for just a couple of minutes about what makes a good learning objective. And these learning objectives are really critical because this really forms the foundation for the rest of your lesson. So a good learning objective is something that's measurable. In other words, there's a way to assess this objective. Now, it may not always be formal. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to give a test or some kind of a quiz or even a formal kind of writing. It could be much more informal, based on your observations of students, what they do in groups, exit slips, something like that. But a good objective is measurable. A good objective is also succinct, and it's direct. You don't need a lot of flowery language. You don't need a paragraph. You need a sentence, and that sentence contains some really concrete verbs. And we'll talk about those verbs a little bit more in a minute as we look at some examples, and I'll follow up with that in some discussion in 377. But those verbs are really important. Finally, and probably most importantly, a good learning objective identifies what students will know, what they'll be able to do, or what they'll feel as a result of the lesson. And we'll talk more about this in 377, but these are three primary ways of knowing, and these are the things that we're really focused on. What kind of facts or what terms or definitions are students going to know as a result of my lesson? What are they going to be able to do? Or how might they see the world differently, or how might they feel differently about characters or events or something like that in the literature? So ultimately, that's what a good learning objective does. It's measurable, it's succinct, it uses strong, concrete verbs, and it identifies what's going to happen, what kind of learning students are going to experience as a result of this lesson. Let's take a look at some learning objectives. Now, these are examples of strong learning objectives, these three. A couple of things I want you to notice about these learning objectives. First of all, look at the verbs. You'll notice that we've got nice, strong verbs, and if you think about these verbs, you can see how we might measure what students are learning here. So for example, students will be able to define metaphor. You can see how that might be assessed, probably in a more formal way. Or this verb, identify metaphors. I can envision a teacher working with this poem and having kids on the paper or in small group discussions or with the teacher on the overhead maybe, identifying those metaphors. It's really important for you to see the verbs that you use in your lesson plan and your objectives ought to be measurable kinds of learning. You can see in the other two that we've got similar verbs. Students will be able to recall significant events, and you can see how that might be measured. They'll evaluate, they'll relate choices to the themes. Second thing that I want you to notice about these objectives is that they all start with students will be able to. Now, that may seem a little bit formulaic, a little bit limiting, but I strongly encourage you to use this sentence starter right now as you learn to write strong lesson objectives. It'll help channel your thinking in the right way. It'll help you create objectives that are measurable, that have nice concrete learning actions, verbs taking place, and it'll make sure that you're focusing on the kinds of learning that matters. These objectives, I can't stress how important a good objective is. You should be able to look at these objectives and think to yourself, I can start to see how a lesson plan would develop around this objective, what kinds of learning activities I might have, even what kinds of assessments I might have. Okay, now let me show you some examples of some weaker learning objectives and talk to you about why I don't think these are quite as effective. In the first two here, you'll see, and this is a common problem for new teachers as they're writing learning objectives, the first two really just kind of describe what's going to happen in class. That's not an objective that tells us what students are going to learn. What are they going to be able to know? What are they going to feel? What are they going to be able to do by the end of the lesson? They really just kind of say, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to discuss the events of Chapter 12, rather than talk about what kind of learning ought to be happening as part of that discussion. The last objective is kind of like that too. Students will read the chapter. Well, what's going to happen while they read the chapter? What reading strategies are we going to be practicing? What knowledge will they gain about the chapter? What inferences might they make? Those kinds of things are much more important to describe in a lesson plan or in objectives than just students are going to read. The third objective is less effective because it has a pretty vague verb in there. Students will learn about metaphors and similes. And I see verbs like this, like understand, students will learn, students will understand this, students will, these aren't as concrete as the ones I showed you on the previous slide. So that could stand some revision. And again, all you have to do is just ask yourself, well, what are they going to learn about metaphors and similes? And how can I test that? Okay, so that's learning objectives. We'll spend some more time in 377 practicing and looking at more examples because this is fundamental. The rest of the planning section is pretty straightforward, but there are a couple of comments I'd like to make. First of all, state or common core curriculum standards. Your objectives in your lesson plan ought to be linked to the state or the common core, depending on what your district's using. Probably at this point you're going to shift more towards using the common core, but it's critical that you have these connections. You're paid to teach the core, and so your lesson objectives, your unit objectives, everything ought to tie back to that core. And just as a matter of sort of convenience for me, please paste the text of those standards in there. Don't just give me numbers because I don't know the core that well to just know what the numbers are. Concepts to be taught. Again, you look at your objectives. If we're going to teach students how to define and identify metaphors and similes, metaphor and simile are concepts that we're going to be teaching. What materials do I need for the learning activities? You might come back later and fill this in once you've scripted out that performing section. But you'll want to make notes to yourself of what you need so that you gather that and you have that ready to go before class starts. Strategies to be used. This trips up some of our students because they're not sure what we mean by here. We're talking about teaching strategies, learning strategies, reading strategies you're going to ask students to develop, writing strategies. Any of those strategies would go in here. Discussion is a strategy. Lecture is a strategy. This kind of a podcast is a strategy. Writing in class, small group work, KWLs, QARs, all of these things are strategies and are all valid to be put in that section. So that's the planning section. Let's move on now and start talking about the second section of the performing section. So in the performing section, again, you want to remember that this is where you're going to script out what you'll actually do for the 45, 90 minutes, whatever time you have. So this is where you're going to decide what learning activities you're going to do, what instructions you'll give students, how they'll break into groups. All that kind of stuff has to be anticipated here in the performing section. So this is a critical part, and it needs a lot of detail. We'll talk more in class about what that detail ought to look like and how you can put all of this together. But for now, let me just give you a quick overview of the different sections here so you're familiar with the template. There's a little space here at the beginning of the performing section for you to take care of some business announcements and things like that. There's also this section, the continuation from a previous lesson. This will be difficult for you as a practicum student because your lessons won't be sequential, but you ought to try to find a way to tie whatever you're doing today into what you did yesterday or the day before if you're on a block schedule. That kind of continuity is really important for students. Now, you might think these are just notes for you, that this is how you continue from one lesson to another, but I found that it's really helpful to share this information with students, to say to them, okay, now yesterday we did this. Today we're going to do something that relates to what we did yesterday, and this is how it relates. That helps them build those connections that give them a sense of continuity throughout the unit. Now this next section on the actual lesson presentation, this is going to be the largest section of your lesson plan. This is where you will script things out. And some questions to consider as you do this is, you'll notice that we've got it divided into 3 sections, and we want you to think as you plan about how you're going to introduce students to these concepts or these skills or strategies or whatever you're going to teach. How will you prepare them to learn about metaphors or about similes or about figurative language or whatever it might be that day? And then how will you direct that? What kind of learning activities will you engage in? What things will students do? And then think in terms of scripting about what instructions you're going to give students. Anticipate some of the things they might say. Anticipate challenges for procedures, how to break into groups, how to turn their work in, how to share in partnerships, all that kind of stuff. This is really where you earn your money, is right here, because there's a lot of scripting, there's a lot of anticipation, there's a lot of preparation and sort of mental rehearsal that goes into putting this section of the lesson together. At the tail end of the template, there's an element that sometimes throws our students off, and that's this one here, this assignment or strategy or skill development section. Now we put this at the tail end of the template, but that isn't usually where it will go. Usually it'll fit somewhere here in the lesson presentation, probably somewhere in the directing the learning or the reinforcing the learning. And not every lesson plan is going to have this section of modeling, guided practice, directions, independent practice, because you may not be teaching skills, you may not be teaching strategies, or there may not be some kind of an assignment associated with your lesson. Now that might be rare, but it's possible. So what you want to do is you want to include this section where it makes the most sense in the lesson presentation section. But you should be familiar by now with this idea of the gradual release of responsibility, where we model or we give students examples of a concept or of a skill, where we practice with them to make sure that they're getting the skill or getting the concept, and when we give them some independent practice. And that independent practice, of course, is always going to be accompanied by some directions that you're going to give students. So this will fit differently probably. It won't always be at the end, but it throws our students off sometimes in the template because we put it at the end. Recognize that this is very portable and that you should use it. Let's say, for instance, that you're going to ask students to write an introduction in class. That's going to be one of your objectives. Well, you want to model that for them, give them some examples, walk them through the process of writing a good introduction, practice with them, and then allow them for some independent practice, and you'll give them some directions with that. Now, the final section of the template is very important, and of course you won't fill this section out until after you've taught. But this is your post-instructional reflection. Reflective thinking is very important in lesson planning and in teaching. And we want you to have an opportunity to provide some notes to yourself, some reflective thoughts about how well the lesson went. In doing so, you might want to think a little bit about what went well, why did it go well, what didn't go so well, why didn't it go very well, what could I do differently next time. All of these things will help you prepare better for the next lesson, the next time you teach this lesson, or the next time you do a similar lesson. Now let me point you to one more resource, and that is the annotated lesson plan template. We've, as a program, we've put together some annotations in that template to help structure your thinking, to help remind you of important things, to help guide you as you plan each lesson. You may not need to start every lesson plan with this annotated model, but I would suggest, especially here in this semester as you're learning to plan a lesson, that you do. I think you'll find it very useful and very helpful to have these reminders and these questions to lead you through these first lesson plans that you develop. And that's it. That's our template from the performing section to the planning section. We'll address questions and do a lot more practice with some of this in both in 377 and also in our practicum in 379.